Hello, welcome to the Old Glory Games podcast. My name is Kyle, and we're here to do episode number 23 and episode 24, part 1 and part 2. And this particular episode, these next two, are going to be about wrestling. I'm excited about this. Greg and I did this a few months ago, and we're excited to give it to you guys now. So because it's so long, we're going to do two parts. This is part 1 of 2, episode 23 of the Old Glory Games podcast. Enjoy. Ooh, yeah, fellas. Welcome to the Old Glory Games podcast, brother. My name is Kyle. Hi, guys. Yes, you're at the right spot. We're talking pro wrestling today. Greg, are you super duper excited?
Oh, yeah, it's what's happening.
Oh, that's pretty good.
That's an awful imitation of Macho Man, but I think out of all the imitations, I think that's the one that's done the most. And the funny thing is, he actually talked like that.
He did. So, yeah, that's right. That's 100% right. I heard that he was in character in character. That's him.
Yeah, that was him. So that's,
wow.
I guess, one of the endearing things about pro wrestling, the lengths to which those guys stayed in character to make it seem real for a lot of people. So yeah, this is going to be a fun episode, I know, for the two of us, because, you know, we grew up watching old school pro wrestling that looks nothing like it looks today, and I know we'll get into more details on that. So, you want to kick it off? You want me to?
Oh, sure. I mean, in fact, I'll tell you what. So this could be a 15-parter. So I'm going to try and keep it within the confines of pro wrestling then and now. So Let's talk about, here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my favorite wrestlers then, and I don't have any favorite wrestlers now because I haven't watched it in about 15 years. So I would say my favorite wrestlers at the very beginning to my favorite wrestlers when I stopped watching it. How about that? And that's probably going to be the Attitude Era, The Rock, The Mankind, Undertaker, those guys. So, all right, so cool. Yeah. So I got to start off wrestling with two people here, or actually one wrestler and one tag team. First one is, let's just start with the tag team. Rocky Johnson and Tony Atlas. Those guys were my guys. They were a black tag team. In fact, Rocky Johnson is the father of The Rock.
The Rock, yeah.
Yeah, and Tony Atlas, another good story about him too, which is more of a dark side. He was there when a guy was murdered in Puerto Rico.
Bruiser Brody, yep.
Yeah, you know about that, right? So
I do.
We can talk about that another time. But those two were battling the Wild Samoans, and I remember one time it was, I was, I don't know, 10, 15. I mean, how old was I? I was 80. I was probably 12, maybe, thinking this was real. I mean, let me say this, guys, before you guys get mad at me. It's real. I look at it as they are stuntmen using storylines because they are putting their lives at risk. So it's real in that regard, but it's just I say they're just stuntmen and performers, but they are absolutely athletes, and what they're doing is real to the point where they can get killed or get seriously hurt. So that's my disclaimer there. But anyway, I'm watching this thinking that it's legitimate in terms of winning or losses. And I'm throwing my remote control at the screen. I thought they're going to lose. They ended up winning. I was so happy, whatever. So that was one thing. And the second thing is my all-time favorite wrestler, even to this very day, is, can you guess who that could be? You probably can't guess.
Let me think.
That's a tough. It's going to be before 85.
Okay, before 85.
Yeah. And
knowing where you lived at that time, so that would be WWF.
WWF, yeah. He was a world champion. That makes it a little easier.
Okay. Was it before Hogan?
Yes.
Was it Backlund?
Yeah, it's only like three.
Yeah, there weren't many.
Bruno
from
Sammartino.
from
Yeah.
Bruno to
Yeah.
superstar Billy Graham.
Yep.
Backlund beat him. The Iron
Yep.
Sheik beat him, and Hogan beat the Iron Sheik. Yeah, so
it was Bob Backlund. I love that guy. The more I read about him, the more I like about him. A genuine guy, was professional and all that. So, how about you, Greg? What's your earliest memories of wrestling and that stand out to you right now?
Sure. So, I started wrestling when I was fairly young. I was certainly, how old? Maybe 6, 7 years old. And I have really fond memories of watching wrestling because my dad and I would watch wrestling. He's the reason why I started watching wrestling. And my dad is not at all into sports. He's less into sports than my mom is. Really, the only two sports that my dad ever watched or I've ever known him to watch was boxing and pro wrestling. And we would have such a great time watching wrestling on Saturday mornings and sometimes, Saturday nights, because you may remember this, up in the area where the WWF was shown, in the New York Northeast area, you could watch wrestling like earlier in the day, and then like late at night, they'd show wrestling again, sometimes from Florida. So sometimes,
really? Wow.
we'd watch that. Oh yeah, we'd watch that sometimes too. But I really enjoyed watching wrestling as a kid with my dad. And when he would bring me wrestling magazines, that was a treat, man. Because that was
black, white, and bloody.
Oh yeah, long before the internet. And it was interesting because, just to explain for people that may not know, because the territories are basically gone. So let's say, like right now, where we live, in the Carolinas, and if you lived here, you watched Mid-Atlantic or Jim Crockett Promotions wrestling. You really didn't know anything about areas outside of your area. So the United States, they were separated or divided into different territories that promoters were in charge of, and they had more or less a gentleman's agreement not to go into each other's territory to try to take their talent. So we talked about the WW, and actually when I was a kid, it was the WWWF, the worldwide.
Yeah, you take it way back.
Oh yeah. So that was basically a Northeast territory. You had Jim Crockett Promotions. That was basically Mid-Atlantic. You had Georgia. It was its own territory. You had Florida. It was its own territory. You had the AWA. That was basically Midwestern states. You had Mid-South Wrestling. That was Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Mississippi, I think. And you had, territories out west. You had Portland territory and some of these other, and they're all, most of them were basically governed under the NWA. Was the governing body of all those different territories. So if you lived in a certain area of the country, you were only aware of the wrestling in your area. There was a Dallas territory where the Von Erichs came to prominence and became famous. So unless, and even back then, I don't know how prevalent cable TV was, but unless you had unless you had a real strong antenna or something, you could really only see the wrestling that was in your area. So you wouldn't be really aware of other territories unless you read magazines and some of these other things. And again, this was before the internet. So like I said, my dad and I, we'd watch wrestling, and it was just so much fun. And to your point, as a little kid, I thought what I was watching was it looked pretty real to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, back then that was the point of it, where the wrestlers would maintain their characters even outside of the ring. Promoters would tell the wrestlers, you know, the good guys were known as baby faces. The bad guys were known as heels. They weren't to be seen together because that would break kayfabe, or the continued illusion that wrestling was indeed real and was what you saw. Because back then, the wrestling business depended upon the house shows, basically going around from town to town in high school gyms, arenas, and whatnot, and have the people come out and see the matches. So let's say if, you know, you're at the Piggly Wiggly and you see your favorite babyface shaking hands and hanging out with his arch nemesis, that was an offense that typically led to them getting fired. Promoters would tell their guys, baby faces and heels are not to be seen in public together. It doesn't matter whether you're friends or not. And when they got to the arenas, they dressed in separate locker rooms. And that illusion was maintained throughout to protect the business. Because back then, if people thought that, or even suspected that, oh, these guys are buddies and, you know, they don't really hate each other. And, you know, what you're seeing is put on. And if it wasn't real enough to where you could suspend your disbelief long enough to invest emotionally in what you saw, then the business was dead. It's not like now where all of these guys and gals are friends. They interact on social media. They sign autographs together and all that. No, it was serious business. Kayfabe was maintained for the sake of the business. Promoters would tell their guys, you better not lose a fight to a civilian or you're fired, because they wanted people to think wrestlers were tougher than your average bear. Do what you got to do, but don't you dare lose a fight to some town person or you're fired. So it was serious business back then. But when I was a little kid, I liked the good guys, the baby faces. I liked them. But as I got older, I started pulling for the heels because that was just more fun to me. So when I was a little kid, who was my favorite wrestler? I actually liked Superstar Billy Graham pretty good, even though he was a heel, but he was a cool heel. I mean, fans cheered him when he beat Bruno. There he is. I've read that they had him beat Bruno. Well, because Bruno had just grown tired of the schedule and being champ and being on the road. He wanted a break, so he wanted the title taken off of him. So Vince McMahon Sr., who owned the promotion at that time, decided, well, we'll have Superstar Billy Graham beat you. So when Superstar beat him, I think he beat him in, Baltimore. And of course he cheated.
And no one knew it was going to happen. Yeah.
No. Yeah. So if you happen to be at that show,
and
shocked. You saw it was shocking. It was a big deal. If you were at a house show and you actually saw the title change hands, that was a major deal. So, of course he cheated because he's a heel and that's what heels do.
Right.
And it was almost like eerie silence. Like the crowd couldn't believe what they saw. And I think after that, Billy Graham just like ran out of the ring, you know, because he there's gonna be a riot here in a minute.
Right, right.
So I heard that they didn't have it at Madison Square Garden or the Boston Garden because they were afraid the fans would riot.
So what you tell the audience a little bit about Bruno Sammartino and how popular this guy was? I mean, it's nothing. Hulk Hogan was probably more popular, but not by much, right?
Oh gosh, just to try to put it in context. So let me see if I can remember this right. So Bruno because back then the WWWF believed in having babyface champions and ethnic champions. So Bruno Sammartino, as you can guess, was Italian, and he was just super popular and super over with the Italian fans, the fans in the Northeast. So he was WWWF champion from, I think, 1964 to 1971. And again, when he dropped the title to Ivan Koloff, you remember him, right?
Yeah. And then they gave it back to him.
Yeah, but see, back then, you didn't see baby faces wrestling baby faces. You just did not see it. So what they had to do
to
get the title, a transitional champion, which was Ivan Koloff. And Koloff, let's see, he lost it to, I think, Pedro Morales beat him.
Oh yeah, Pedro Morales. Yeah, he was very popular too, actually.
He was. And again, oh gosh, what was this? Was he Puerto Rican or Mexican? I can't remember. I know he was Hispanic. So again, an ethnic babyface champion. Morales dropped it to Stan Stasiak, another transitional champion who was only there to get it off Pedro, so Bruno could beat him and get the belt back. Because again, you weren't going to have Pedro, a babyface, wrestle Bruno, another babyface, for the belt. So Bruno won it from Stan Stasiak, I think, in 73, and kept the belt until 77. There's Pedro Morales, very popular champion. When Bruno beat him Superstar beat him in 77. Back then, these champions held the belt longer than like a month or two. Right. It didn't switch hands constantly. It meant something to be the world champ. And that's how the business was run. Being world champ was a big deal. And to switch gears to the NWA. So when we moved, and our territory was Mid-Atlantic or Crockett, by then I started liking the heels. So in the beginning, I liked Roddy Piper.
Oh yeah, he's good.
He's one of the all-time great heels. But he left for the WWF. So at that point, my guy was Ric Flair. And he's been my guy ever since as far as singles wrestlers. And, he was the world champ in the NWA multiple times.
Many times, yeah.
Yeah, yes, the 16-time world champ. So just to give, maybe our younger listeners and viewers a little bit of context. So the WWE, as it's known now, and I think their champ, I think it's Cody Rhodes, and his father was
that was a good match, actually, but I watched that.
Yeah, Dusty Rhodes, who actually, while I'm thinking about it, so there's Flair with the big gold belt.
Yep.
The first wrestling match I ever went to was the Great American Bash in Greensboro.
Oh, you went there?
Yeah.
Oh, that's legendary. That particular one in Greensboro?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
It was fantastic. So the main event was Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes in a cage.
Yes. That's legendary.
Oh, yeah. And of course, I was rooting for Ric Flair, but Dusty won. And you should have heard the pop. Man, the fans went crazy. And they stood and cheered Dusty. And I actually cheered Dusty too, because I just saw the world title change hands.
Wow.
And back then, you didn't see that every day.
No,
so people stayed probably at least 10 minutes standing around cheering Dusty. It was fantastic. It was a tremendous, moment, and I was there to see it. So yeah, Cody is Dusty's son, one of Dusty's sons. He's got another son, Dustin, that wrestled also. But so Cody is
Goldust.
Yeah, Goldust. Yes.
Yep.
For people who don't know, he was Goldust. And so Cody, hilarious character, by the way. Oh gosh. But so Cody, I think, unless it's changed, I think he finally won the WWE title.
I watched that
now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So today, yes, this roster of wrestlers, they'll travel, all over the country, and even there's an H board there, all over the country, and sometimes internationally. Their schedule is pretty tough. But back in Flair's day, when he was NWA World Champion, he was what was known as a traveling champion. So what he did, he would travel from territory to territory, wrestling the territory's top guys, and his schedule was brutal.
Yeah.
He was only home. He was on the road, I think, over 300 nights.
Now, who are we talking about now? I'm sorry. Is this Ric Flair?
Yeah.
Ric Flair. Okay. Gotcha.
Like over 300 days a year. I've seen different documentaries where his kids would say he was hardly ever home. He might be home like a day or two for Christmas and a few other days throughout the year. But a traveling champion was on the road all the time. And he would have to go across the country defending the belt. He'd go to Japan. He'd go all over. So he was a true world champion at that point. And the NWA, for those that aren't aware, they would have their yearly meeting, and the different promoters would get together and they'd vote on who the world champion would be.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So Crockett, which was the promoter for Mid-Atlantic, that was basically Flair's home base at that time. So Crockett had a lot of pull, and Flair was voted champion, more times than not. But to get back to what I was talking about earlier, so once we moved here, after Piper and Snuka, I was a real big fan of Jimmy Snuka. So
I was too. My gosh.
Oh yeah, to tell your story. So again, those guys maintained kayfabe, and Jimmy Snuka was a bad guy. He was heel.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was.
But I liked him. It's like, man, look at that physique and look at that look. He's looks like a wild man, and I just liked his look and how he wrestled. So, I think like at the end of like each episode, because they show wrestling like every Saturday morning, and they wrestle the matches like in a TV studio. And like at the end of the broadcast, they would post like their address if you wanted to write the wrestlers a letter or something like that. It's like, I think I'll do that. So I drew a picture of Jimmy Snuka, and I wish I still had it or took a picture of it or something. I used to like to draw back then. So I took a lot of time and care in drawing the picture. And I drew the picture, and I put a little letter with it saying, hi, Mr. Snuka, or something like that. You're my favorite wrestler. Could you please sign my picture or send me an autograph and send it back? And I was a little bit disappointed when I never heard from him. And then a little bit later, as I got older, I realized it's like Jimmy Snuka's a heel. He's not going to sign your picture or acknowledge your picture or send you an autograph. That's not what a heel would do,
Right.
So unfortunately, I didn't hear back from him, but that's how into it I was. And as far as tag teams, the Midnight Express was my all-time favorite tag team. Just fantastic to watch. What's that?
Oh, nothing with the Four Horsemen. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Who's
the Midnight Express? Who are those guys?
Okay, so have you heard of Jim Cornette?
Oh yeah. He's a great. Yeah. He's got a lot of stories.
He can talk, can he?
He was a fixer. I thought he was a fixer.
Yeah. Well, he went on to be a booker, a promoter. He ran Smoky Mountain Wrestling for a few years, but at that time he was a manager.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize.
And he managed the Midnight Express. So it was Loverboy Dennis Condrey and Beautiful Bobby Eaton. And then Condrey left, and then he was replaced with Sweet Stan Lane. So towards the end of their run, it was Sweet Stan Lane and Beautiful Bobby, the Midnight Express. And I just enjoyed watching those guys. They're the Horsemen. That's the original group of Horsemen there. And to me, they were the greatest faction of all time. You can talk about the NWO and you can talk about Degeneration X, but no, it all started with the Four Horsemen. They were the greatest faction of all time. But yeah, going back to what we were talking about as far as how wrestling felt real, especially when you're a kid. So wrestling was based on very basic, fundamental principles. It was good against evil.
Yeah.
And, anybody can get behind that. You've got your good guys and you've got your bad guys. And everybody, most people, like I said, I cheer for the heels. But, most people are going to cheer for the babyface. And they are invested emotionally into their favorite wrestler overcoming and defeating the dastardly heels that cheat to win and say mean things during their promos and just do the worst things possible to the baby faces. So to get even and get payback, you're going to pay, $10-12 to go to your local arena and watch your favorite wrestler take on their arch rival or arch nemesis. It would get built up on TV. That's where they talked about the upcoming matches, where they're going to be. Hey, we'll be at the Greensboro Coliseum such and such a date. I'll be taking on Magnum TA or whatever it is, basically talking them into the building, because the wrestling shows back then, it's not like now where you can see just about every match is just about a main event match. Back then, the TV shows, they were all squash matches. Why? Because they wanted you to go to the arena to see the main event level matches, and they wanted you to pay attention to the feuds and the rivalries that were getting built up on TV. And once you saw it on TV, it's like, I've got to go see this. I've got to go see Dusty Rhodes wrestle Flair. Flair cheated last time and Dusty got beat up by the Horsemen. I got to go see Dusty get his revenge against Ric Flair and that kind of thing. That's how they got people into wrestling and got them emotionally invested in the wrestlers. And if you've ever been to a live wrestling match and hear the people just carry on and scream and yell at the referee to turn around because the bad guy's cheating and just totally immersing themselves into the matches because it just feels so real to them. And the heat the heels would get to where, the police would have to escort them out because people are trying to hit them with bottles or stab them or burn them with cigarettes or just whatever it is, because the bad guys have convinced the audience so much that that's what they really are. I mean, that's golden. I mean, that's what made the business what it was. And fans, flattening the bad guys' tires and, just trashing their cars because they're so upset at them because they cheated, their favorite babyface wrestler.
Yeah.
In that perspective, from that perspective, wrestling was real to people. They got into it that much. And the wrestlers themselves could not afford to break that illusion for people. It's kind of like when you go see a magician. When you go see a magician, you can suspend your disbelief long enough to believe what you're seeing and be amazed at what you're seeing. But if the magician came out after he was done, all right, folks, I'm going to show you how I did all this stuff.
Right.
I mean, it would just ruin it for you, right? And you really wouldn't want to go back. It's like, I know all the secrets now. It's the same thing with wrestling. And unfortunately, that's what happened when Vince McMahon came out and said, oh, well, it's not real. It's sports entertainment and da-da-da-da-da. Most people suspected that. But when you come out and just admit to everybody that's what it is, it just ruins it for a lot of people. Once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't get it back in.
Well, he was in trouble legally, so he was coming out.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
But go ahead. That's all I cut you off.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, and that brings context to the why. But, back then, and I'll tell you another story. So back in 1986, I think it was, Magnum TA, who was a rising superstar.
Oh, yeah, I remember him.
And he was well on his way to winning the world title. I think that was the plan, to have him eventually beat Ric Flair for the title. So he was on his way back from a match, I think, in Greenville, South Carolina. Back then, a lot of those trips, the guys drove from town to town. So he was driving back late one night. I think he had like a brand new Porsche or something. Now, Magnum was a big guy. He was like 6'3", 240, 245.
Yeah, he was huge.
Yeah, muscular, good-looking guy. So he was...
Yeah, I remember him. Yeah, now I remember him.
Yeah, he was closed up in that Porsche. And I think within like a mile or two of his house, he hit a puddle or something. And his car veered off the road and either hit a tree or a telephone pole. And it exploded multiple vertebrae in his back. And he was basically paralyzed. And his...
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, his wrestling career was over. But see, back then... Again, there was no internet, so the fans really couldn't truly know everything that was going on, but we knew it was bad. So he was in the hospital for, I think, weeks and months. And, of course, the other guys on the roster, heels and baby faces alike, there's Magnum, they were really friends with him. So the heels could not just go through the front door of the hospital to visit Magnum, because you couldn't have fans seeing them visit Magnum. So Flair and the Horsemen, they had to like sneak like through a back entrance, like at night or something.
Yeah.
So they could visit Magnum, because it was critical to the business that they not be seen with Magnum, because he's a babyface and they're heels. So that's what they had to do to maintain kayfabe. And another story where I think Flair was in a plane crash in 75, which I think, yeah, he broke his back. And I think maybe one or two guys on the flight maybe died. I know Greg Valentine, you remember him?
Yeah, Greg the Hammer.
Yeah, his dad was Johnny Valentine. Every bit as tough as Greg. He was on that plane, and I think he was paralyzed in that crash and never wrestled again, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a serious crash. I think the doctors told Flair he'd probably never walk again, certainly would never wrestle again. So Wahoo McDaniel was like one of his, I think, big rivals back then. The hospital would not let Wahoo in the hospital to see Flair, because I think at the time Wahoo might have been a heel or something, and they were afraid that Wahoo was going to beat Flair up in the hospital, so they would not let him in. I mean, that's how real it was to people. So it was critical to maintain that illusion that yes, these guys really hate each other. And yes, if they had a chance, they'd jump one another in the parking lot. And yes, you would have to protect one from the other if they were in the hospital, because, they may attack them as they're lying defenseless in their hospital bed. So that's how real wrestling was to people back then. And it was so popular. There are stories. So the Rock and Roll Express, which they were the Midnight Express's arch rivals. There's Greg the Hammer Valentine. They went to Carowinds. They had to shut down Carowinds because the girls and the fans were just going so crazy over them. They shut it down. It was just amazing. And a similar story.
Honky tonk.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Rhythm and Blues, I think they were back then. There's a honky tonk man behind them. Yeah. So in Dallas, we talked about the Von Erichs. They went to Six Flags, and the same kind of reaction. They shut down Six Flags because the fans were just going so crazy for them. They were like rock stars.
Yeah.
They really couldn't go out in public. Ricky Morton from the Rock and Roll Express said he couldn't even go to the mall. He couldn't go to the store. He'd get mobbed by fans. He said he put a ball cap on and took his hair under the ball cap.
But they're so big. How do you hide that?
Yeah. People still knew who he was. So he couldn't go anywhere. I actually met him one night years ago in Greensboro. And when he walked in, it was, people knew who he was. And again, oh yeah. These guys were just super over, super popular. And it was a grand time to be a wrestler because the business was such to where people really got into it. And now it's just so radically different. Yeah, there's Ricky Morton on the left. But I think that can kind of segue into wrestling later on after the cat was let out of the bag as far as, what wrestling really was. And I can't stand the term sports entertainment because I think that ruined wrestling for me. But, to what wrestling is today. So I'll kick it back to you. I think that's context as to what wrestling used to be and how people responded at wrestling matches and how they were so intense and so involved in the matches and with their favorite wrestlers.
Well, I'm really impressed by your knowledge of wrestling. I went into, I say, probably a 6-month dive in wrestling, watching just about everything I could get my hands on. Documentaries, mini documentaries, there's lots of content out there from the history of everything. You broke it down great. Was it Superstar Billy Graham and Sammartino and was it Buddy Rogers? Was that the first guy who made?
Yeah, so Buddy Rogers, if I'm not mistaken, was the first WWWF champion, if I'm not mistaken. I think he's a former NWA champion too.
Yeah. So, but yeah, all that history is just really, really interesting, especially the various territories, and trying to break it down to the people who may not know everything that's going on here. I'd give it from a layman's standpoint because Greg absolutely knows more about the subject than I do. However, essentially, it was a bunch of, like you were saying before, the country was broken out in different areas, almost like a gang or a mafia. This is my territory, this is your territory. But there was gentlemen agreements, like he said, we're not going to venture into that area. And one of those territories was Vince McMahon Sr. And just correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here, Greg. But essentially, he had a territory, and his son wanted to be in the business. He did other stuff too, odds and end jobs, some announcements and that kind of stuff like that. But when the opportunity came for him to buy the company from his dad, he took it, and then without his dad knowing, he went out and started consolidating and getting these groups together. Cable television came into play, and the business started to change, and now you have a WWF taking off, and of course, then you had the Hulkamania stuff happening, and that from there WrestleMania. I won't get into that because that's a whole nother way we can go, unless you want to talk about it personally. But what you said was fantastic there, Greg. But you mentioned about kayfabe and how that's like kayfabe is pretty much pretend. So we're going to pretend that this is the storyline, and the storyline is everything, and it's almost like a fantasy or fairy tale or soap opera. It's more accurately probably for adults. And these characters are so intense, like you were saying. I thought they were real. I thought the storylines were real, and but it was not real. And Bobby the Brain Heenan, who was a manager at the time, who basically said, "Look, we never said it was fake. You just tried to prove that it wasn't." So, so Bobby the Heenan, that was a cool thing. And it was almost like finding out that there's no Santa Claus. It was really, really like, heartbreaking in some ways. But to that point, Bret the Hitman Hart, one of the guys I like, not my favorite, but I think he's cool. He's got a brother named Brett. No, I'm sorry, Owen. Hart. Owen
yeah.
Hart. And so they were best friends, never got in the fight ever. But Owen wanted to be in the business, and so for him to get him in the business, Brett, who was a champion, basically leveraged his position in the company to get Owen to come into the business. And Owen was probably a better wrestler than Brett was. So the point is, so they had the storyline where bad brother, good brother, and they were just, it was a nasty kayfabe type of thing. But the whole time they're pretending, and so they couldn't go to dinner together. They had it was like whatever. So they took it to another level. Greg, they for like 2 years didn't see each other and at all. But one day they were it just so happened, things happen when you're traveling and scheduling. They happened to be in the same airport on the same flight at the same time. It happened to be in the same line together, and they had to act like they didn't like each other. And so I think Brett or Owen was doing something, and I think this isn't exactly what happened, but something similar. I think Brett said something like, "Can you pass me that whatever behind me, that bag, whatever?" And then Owen gave it to him, and then another guy behind him said, "I knew you guys were friends. I knew you guys were friends." So,
oh man,
so that's the story that Brett tells, and so I watch a lot of these interviews too. So that goes. So what you're saying, that speaks to exactly what you're saying, Greg. And this is actually probably 20 years after the times of Bruno Sammartino. This is like in the 90s going up. And so leading into that as a segue, I will talk a little bit about that last era that I really loved about the wrestling. The first wrestling was the Bob Backlund era, the Jimmy Fly Snooker era. By the way, I couldn't stand Don Morocco. I hated Don Morocco with a passion. Finds out he's actually a super nice guy. So it's kind of, my whole world's like crazy now. The guys I hated were like super duper nice now in real life. I'm like, what?
Oh yeah.
He was mean. He was a mean SOB, whatever. So anyway, so it was that era. And then of course the Hulkamania era was incredible. But then the Attitude era, we had people like The Rock, you had people like Stone Cold, you had people like Undertaker, you had people like Mankind, who's my favorite in that whole era, because Mankind was just a guy who just didn't care about his body. And we watched all the pay-per-views because my neighbor, you remember Richard, right? Richard?
Oh yeah.
My neighbor, yeah. So without giving too much away, I don't want to put him on blast here, but his wife worked for the cable company. And so we got all the pay-per-views, it was legal. So every pay-per-view we go over there and watch a fight, and watch a wrestling match, whatever. And so, in fact, Owen Hart, when he passed away on that incident where he was coming down from the ceiling, that was the pay-per-view. And we got that one as well. And they didn't show it, of course, but it was a really weird night, that one. But that era there was really, really super cool and fun. But that, and I'm going to throw this back to you, Greg, because you're so much more. Well, I'll say this first, and then I'll go to a couple more points and throw it back to you. But that whole era kind of blurred the line between, and I had a picture there before. I won't bring it up now, but it was a picture of Stone Cold Austin at WrestleMania 13. He's bleeding on the mat. I think he's fighting Bret the Hitman Hart, and Bret the Hitman Hart is a babyface all the way, and Stone Cold Steve Austin is a heel, but it was a submission match, an I Quit match or something like that. And so of course, Stone Cold cuts himself. He's bleeding all over the place. And so what happened was what Vince McMahon didn't know was happening was that his babyface was becoming a heel, and his heel was becoming a babyface before his very eyes. He didn't even know it. And so what happened was the audience liked the fact that Stone Cold was a man of the people. He wasn't giving up. He was drinking beer in the audience. He didn't give a darn about anything. And so he didn't quit. He just passed out. And at that moment in time, that's when the Attitude Era started, where now it's a blur between black and white. There is no babyface, so to speak, anymore, or heel, so to speak. It's whatever. It's whatever the storyline dictates. And I believe your guy, what's the guy? You said that the Fixer guy, what's the guy's name you said?
Jim Cornette.
Yeah, wasn't he a writer too?
Yeah.
He write storylines too. So, and so there's there's another story writer that came after him that they bumped heads on. There's a whole other storyline there too.
Vince Russo, yeah.
Yeah, you know all that. So it's just really interesting how what worked before suddenly didn't work anymore because the culture changed, this attitude era changed, this anti-hero type element happened. So I'll pause that for a second here. I'm going to cover a few more points here. You mentioned the Von Erichs guys. There's a movie called The Iron Claw. Came out last year, I believe. I'm starting to watch that. It's about the Von Erichs brothers or family.
Yes, the Von Erich family. Yep.
Yep. So I'm watching that. I'm in the first 30 minutes of that. There's a website, or actually, there's a YouTube channel, which this guy has almost every single wrestling magazine that's ever been published, and his whole channel is just to go through the pages of it. I think it's missing like 3 magazines of like 20 years. You know, he's got like hundreds of these magazines. So that's a good channel to go check out. And lastly, lastly for me right now is the movie called The Wrestler. I forget the guy's name who played in that. He played in
Mickey Rourke, wasn't it?
Mickey Rourke, yeah, Mickey Rourke. That's an interesting movie too. I thought it was pretty good. So those are my inklings of what's more of a modern flavor there. But the Attitude Era with Mankind and The Rock is just so funny to watch these guys. And I thought it was, the whole X-Pac, those guys, man, just the whole like hardcore matches. It just got really, really crazy where they were like wrestling anywhere, chairs, barbed wire. And the storylines got crazy, blowing up Vince McMahon's car. There was no end to that stuff. So what's your thoughts of the storylines now, especially in the Attitude Era, where you had stuff like that, very sensationalized, to say the least? I mean, Jerry Springer on crack for the most part, versus the black and white babyface heel strict line and the storyline emphasis on having good prevail in the end. Well, there goes episode 23. That's part 1 of our pro wrestling episode. I hope you enjoyed that. Coming up next week will be episode 24 of the Old Glory Games podcast, part 2 of our pro wrestling podcast episode. For the Old Glory Games podcast, my name is Kyle, and I will see you in the next one.